Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hi, Paul.
Hello, Vivek. Thank you so much for taking the time to be part of the Quarantine Tapes. Tell me, how have you been living these last 7 delirious months? What have you been up to during this time of quarantine?
Well, it has been quite a roller coaster for us. My wife and me and our 2 small kids, who are 4 and 2, came down from Washington, D.C. to Miami in early March to visit family. And we ended up staying here because everything was closing down. So we've been with my parents, my sister and brother-in-law and grandmother and 2 cats for the last 7.5 months.
And that's where you grew up, as I learned, in Miami.
That's right. Yep. We moved here when I was 3, and I went through all of grade school and left here after high school.
Palmetto School, I saw.
Oh, yes. Yeah, good memory. Yeah, Miami Palmetto Senior High School. That's right.
Now, Vivek, you've written a book called Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a sometimes, very important word, sometimes lonely world. Now, what interested me in reading your book is to notice that before calling it Together, your initial title for the book was Radical Love. Can you say more about that and why that title didn't make it? I'm sure it has something to do with publishers, but there must be some grain of importance in you wanting to call it Radical Love.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Paul. And the reason it's not called Radical Love is because I thought of the title too late after the book was already sort of in production. But the reason that title came to mind because while this is a book that I wrote about social connection and about the power of our relationships and the consequences of loneliness, what I came to realize at the end of it was that this really was a book about love and about how to take a radical approach to love, which is to put it at the center of our lives and to think about the fact that love is most clearly manifest in our relationships with other people. That is the circumstance in which we are best able to give and to receive love. And that's why our relationships are so powerful. But the challenge we face in the modern world is that so much of our life is built not around relationships, but around work and around pursuing society's model of success, which is often based on acquiring wealth and power and fame.
Transactions.
That's right. But, but we know intrinsically that it is in our relationships with each other that we derive our greatest joy and that we find our greatest comfort and satisfaction. And, one of the things I reflected on in the book were my experiences with patients over the years. And I remember so clearly many of the conversations I had with patients at the end of their life when there was nothing left to offer in terms of medicine or surgery. And I was sitting with them at their bedside in those final moments. And what struck me is that every time, that I was in that circumstance and I was privileged to have those conversations, people talked about not how much money they had made or what their last position was in their company or how famous they had become. What they talked about in those final moments were their relationships, the ones that had brought them great joy, the ones they wished they had spent more time with, the ones that had broken their heart.
It reminds me so much of Art Buchwald, who said, the best things in life aren't things.
Right. The lesson that I took from those beautiful conversations and moving conversations I was lucky to have with those patients was that not only are people at the center of what gives us meaning and joy, but we don't have to wait until the end of our lives also to realize that our lives are best when we build them around people when we prioritize relationships. And that's really what the book is about. It's about how to build a people-centered life that is guided and fueled by love, compassion, and kindness.
And so hard at this particular moment, and we'll get into that very soon. But there's three terms that I'd like in a way for you to help me understand, perhaps even define, and perhaps define both medically speaking and maybe psychologically. And the three terms are isolation, solitude, loneliness. What are the difference between those three terms as you understand them, Vivek?
It's a really great question, and there are important differences. So loneliness, it turns out, is a subjective state of being. It's a state where the connections we feel we need in our lives are greater than the connections we have. And in that context, we feel lonely. But very importantly, it's different from an objective term like isolation, which is more a descriptor of the number of people we have around us. But we know that you can be surrounded by hundreds of people, thousands of people, and still feel quite alone, as many of the students were on college campuses that I met when I was Surgeon General, who told me that they were struggling with loneliness. But you can also be only surrounded by one or two people and not feel lonely at all if you have strong connections with them and you feel you can be yourself around them. The last piece is around solitude. And what is solitude? Well, it turns out that solitude is a state of being alone, but it's a state of peaceful and almost welcome aloneness, a state where we are able to let the noise around us settle, where we can allow ourselves to recenter, to reground ourselves, when we can reflect deeply in a way that we often find difficult in a world that is constantly racing and where we're constantly bombarded by information in our social media feeds and news.
Marianne Moore, the great poet, said, "The cure for loneliness is solitude."
Yeah, and there's something very important in those words of wisdom. And it's something that I find myself focusing on a bit in the writing of this book, which is an unexpected and counterintuitive lesson, which is that the secret to connecting with other people is to deeply connect with ourselves, that our foundation for connecting and building relationships is really rooted in our comfort with ourselves, our ability to embrace ourselves, to know who we are. That is an easy thing to say, a hard thing to do in a world that is constantly telling us that we are not enough.
Right.
I think about the fact that when I was growing up, it's not like the notion that we are not enough or that the culture of comparison was non-existent. In fact, people have been comparing themselves to other people for thousands of years.
Yes.
But what was different is that we had fewer channels a few decades ago through which messages could reach people. And today, if you're growing up, and you're in high school or college, or even if you're older, you are bombarded through so many channels, with news, with advertisements, with messages that often tell you that you're not thin enough, you're not good looking enough, you're not fit enough, you're not smart enough, you're not famous enough, you're not wealthy enough. They're often paired with an offering, a service or a product that will help fill that gap. But the other piece that's worth noting here is that if you are a heavy social media user, and especially if you consume a lot of social media passively, you can often find that in looking at other people's curated posts, these perfect versions of their life, that you can often be made to feel worse about your own life. And so you put all of this together, and what you find is that in the modern world, there are many people who walk around feeling that they are just not enough, who feel insecure about who they are, so they don't measure up. And when you approach another person, another relationship, feeling like you're not enough, you find yourself more often than not focusing on how you're coming across, trying to curate what you say to match what their expectations may be, as opposed to being yourself. And that in turn can make our connections with other people more tenuous and less enjoyable.
And, I think when you were talking about the culture of comparison, I think one of the effects of social media is to make particularly young people feel that not only are they not enough, but they're not at this party. They haven't been invited. They feel excluded, and feeling excluded is another way, perhaps, of feeling tremendously lonely. You've said it that the most common ailment I saw as a doctor was not heart disease or diabetes. It was loneliness. That's a very interesting comment coming particularly from a doctor.
Yes, and there are two things I would say about that, Paul. Is one is I felt very ill-equipped to handle that as a doctor, because I had not really thought deeply about how to approach loneliness. I didn't know much about it from medical training in terms of what the consequences of it were. I was very familiar with the feeling because I had struggled myself with a great deal of loneliness as a child, but I wasn't sure how to help a patient who was struggling with loneliness. But the other thing that's important, and the reason I saw loneliness so often, is because it is extremely common. And this is something I didn't fully appreciate until I was a Surgeon General and traveling around the country and talking to people in communities across America, which is that it turns out that loneliness is far more common than we realize. In fact, the studies tell us that more adults struggle with loneliness in America than have diabetes or than who smoke. And we're talking, even if you look at more conservative studies, that it's around 22% of adults in the U.S. who struggle with loneliness. That's a Kaiser Family Foundation survey. But other studies have put that number more recently even higher, and even closer to 50%, according to Cigna, which is one of the major health insurers in the country. And so however you look at it, it turns out loneliness is extremely common, and it's consequential too. It turns out people who struggle with loneliness have a higher risk of heart disease and premature death, of depression and anxiety and dementia and a host of other conditions. So all of this to say that loneliness is more than a bad feeling.
Right.
It's something that has a profound impact on our health, our performance, and our sense of fulfillment.
And it's more than a bad feeling, but one of the ill effects of loneliness is that it is stigmatized.
Yes. And that's unfortunate.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, and it creates a sense of further loneliness, which expresses itself often in the form of shame.
That's exactly right. And that word you just used, Paul, shame, is a powerful and very accurate way, I think, to represent how people feel when they're struggling with loneliness. Because what we somehow tell people as a society, what modern culture tells people, is that if you're lonely, something must be wrong with you.
Right.
That you must not be likable enough, or you must have something wrong with you in some way. And the reality is really quite different. The reality is that loneliness is a natural signal that all of us experience at some point in our lives. And it's a natural signal like hunger or thirst that crops up in our body when we are lacking something we need for survival. And in this case, that is social connection. And when we, just like hunger or thirst, if we are able to satisfy that need, and then it will be short-lived. So if we feel lonely and we are able to pick up the phone and call a friend, or we're able to get in the car and go visit someone we care about and whose company we enjoy, and perhaps we won't feel lonely for so long. But it's when that loneliness is prolonged, when it lasts for a while, that's when we start to see some of these physical and mental health consequences arise. Yeah, I should also just lastly say, Paul, though, that this shame around loneliness that you aptly raised, this is part of what makes loneliness so invisible. Because you can look around you and think to yourself, gosh, I must be the only one struggling with loneliness.
Yes.
Everyone else seems to be
Yes.
living a great life. They're
Yes.
going out on weekends. They're having great birthday celebrations. They have great vacations they're taking. Like, life seems to be great, judging from conversation in their social media feeds. But because, the stigma around loneliness, we tend not to share with each other when we're feeling lonely. And so it remains sort of in the shadows. And the other reason it remains hidden, is because it's what I call the great masquerader. Is it looks like different things in different people. So loneliness sometimes can look like depression. It can look like withdrawal. It can look like social withdrawal. It can look like anxiety. It can look like, interestingly, like anger and short-temperedness, which is often how it appears in men. And so if you recognize that, then you start to understand that you actually might be around people who are struggling with loneliness all the time. In fact, you likely are. But you may not know it because it's not so easy to see.
The philosopher Hannah Arendt had an incredible comment about loneliness. I took this from reading the work of another philosopher, Samantha Rose Hill, where she quotes Arendt, who says, loneliness as a concomitant of homelessness and uprootedness is, humanly speaking, the very disease of our time.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. And this word home is actually very important here because, home, when we think about what it means to be home, to have a home, to feel at home, it's often very much defined by our relationships. We tend to feel at home when we're with people who understand us, when we're with people with whom we can really be ourselves and show up authentically. And what I felt like I was seeing as I traveled around the country and heard about people who were lonely is many of them were essentially saying to me that they didn't have a sense of home. And these were people who, in a sense, felt homeless even though they had a roof over their heads. And what's really striking to me is that all of us have that common need to feel at home, and that's defined by our relationships. And when we don't have those relationships, we feel unmoored. And no amount of accomplishment or fame or wealth can create that kind of home. And that's why, I and you and probably so many people know people who are wealthy or powerful or famous or all three, yet they are profoundly unhappy because they don't have relationships, they don't have a sense of truly being at home.
Vivek, under President Obama, you were Surgeon General. Now, for our listeners, and for my benefit too, what does a Surgeon General do? And do you miss being Surgeon General? Yeah,
well, the U.S. Surgeon General has two primary responsibilities. One is to provide the public with the best possible scientific information about health so people can make good decisions for themselves and their family. And that could be about chronic health issues. It could be about, health crises that come up like the COVID-19 pandemic we're dealing with. But the other responsibility is to oversee one of the uniformed services in the U.S. government, which is the U.S. Public Health Service, Commission Corps, a group of 6,600 officers, doctors, dentists, nurses, physical therapists, pharmacists, public health engineers, and others, who dedicate themselves each day to addressing public health challenges in the country, and who also respond during times of emergency, and we deploy them, for example, during hurricanes and tornadoes to various parts of the country to shore up the health infrastructure. And we also, during the Ebola outbreak, for example, in 2014-15, deployed hundreds of officers to Liberia to help set up what was called the Monrovia Medical Unit. And so these are the two twin responsibilities of the Surgeon General. But there are times where I certainly do miss the work. I miss the community, in fact, that we had there. I miss the officers that I was privileged to work with, who are such dedicated and thoughtful people. But I'm very grateful to have had that opportunity to serve, Paul. Because keep in mind, I was not the typical or sort of Surgeon General in the sense that I didn't come from the same background as most of my predecessors. I was also significantly younger when I was asked to serve, and there were reasons for that. President Obama and his team wanted to make sure that the office was modernized, that it was able to communicate in a way that made the best use of modern day communication technologies. And they wanted the office to play an important role in addressing a series of crises from Ebola, but also like the opioid crisis.
And I'd like to talk to you about that, because in that capacity, you led such a strong fight against opiates. And I'm curious, at this moment in time, Vivek, how do you view what's happening now with the Sackler family and with Purdue? I mean, I know they are supposed to pay out something like $8 billion, which is a lot, but not compared to their profits. How do you view this moment where we're discovering just the extent of the extraordinary harm?
It's hard to fully grasp the profound harm that's being done and that has been done as a result of the opioid epidemic. It's more than the numbers on a page in terms of lives lost, people hospitalized, days of work lost. It's also about the human suffering that is taking place, not only those who are addicted to opioid medications, but their friends and families and others who have been there with them, who have struggled and suffered, as well. This is a profound challenge, but you're not getting a lot of news time because we are really consumed with the COVID-19 pandemic. But what we're seeing, unfortunately, is during this pandemic that rates of opioid overdose have in fact increased because it's a time of extraordinary stress. And so I think we will be forced to contend with this epidemic around opioids for still some time, for some years to come. But I think what it does show us, though, is a couple of things. I think it shows us that we have to be humble in medicine and recognize that our treatments also have consequences, and we've got to be mindful of how to manage those consequences. In this case, we had a pain medication that certainly was effective at relieving pain, but was highly addictive, and we didn't recognize that until it was too late. And the second thing we have to recognize is that when it comes to taking responsibility for what we create, for what we prescribe, that could not be more important. And opioids is a great example of that. That means not only do doctors and nurse practitioners and does the health profession more broadly need to be clear and competent in how it trains its professionals to prescribe and recognize addiction, but it also means that we have to hold companies that produce these kind of medications to a high standard. And what we saw with Purdue is that there was a long history of making these medications and misrepresenting what exactly they did and downplaying the concerns. And we are still paying the price of that today. So, there's multi-billion-dollar, settlement of around $8 billion or so. That's a sizable penalty. Does it come close to covering the cost of Purdue's actions? I don't think it's even close. That's the damage that they have done and that others have done who have contributed to this pandemic is extraordinary, and we'll be dealing with it for years to come.
Vivek, recently Joe Biden was endorsed by the New England Journal of Medicine and by Science, which in the case of Science, I know it's the first time that the magazine, so prestigious in its 175 years history, has done that. What is the meaning of that, do you think?
We've not seen anything like this before, Paul. This is the New England Journal of Medicine has more than 200-year history of being really one of the preeminent journals in medicine. They've never endorsed a presidential candidate in a U.S. race. Neither have some of the other journals that have stood up, Science, Scientific American, and others. But the fact that they are all stepping up tells us that this pandemic and the unfortunate response that we've had in the U.S. to the pandemic, I would say the ineffective response from government, has really pushed many organizations and individuals who typically try to stay in a nonpartisan lane. It's pushed them to say, you know what, this is a moment that's different. It's a moment where we have to put health, well-being, and the country above our desire to stay silent. There are times, Paul, polarized times like now, where even stating the truth can be perceived as political.
Right.
Now, advising somebody to wear a mask to help prevent the spread of COVID can be seen in political terms because this response has been politicized. But if we allow that to continue to constrain us, if we allow the politicization of science and public health to prevent us from speaking the truth about science and public health, then all of us will be worse off. And what the New England Journal of Medicine did, what you've seen others do, retired generals, other prestigious institutions that are typically nonpartisan, which is to stand up for the truth, even if it's perceived as political. That is actually, I think, a sign of the gravity of the moment, but it's also a sign of the courage that's needed for people to step out of their comfort zones, speak up for what's needed, and to help us get on the path of addressing this pandemic and ultimately healing the wounds that it's inflicted on our country.
I believe you've been in touch with Biden and his campaign. What would be different if he were president now instead of Trump? And if he were to be elected, what would you advise him to prioritize in the realm of medicine, but not only medicine, but mental health more broadly speaking?
Well, I think that I think a lot would be different, and I have certainly spent time with him over the last 7 or 8 months during this pandemic, advising in a variety of capacities. But what I've really been struck by with Vice President Biden is that he is a couple things. One is it's his tremendous respect for science and expertise. He knows that the path out of this pandemic has to be guided by science and by facts and by public health experience. The other thing that I've been struck by is that there are two themes that seem to guide him consistently in his approaches. And those two themes are the personal and the practical. But the personal, meaning that he is constantly thinking about data in the context of individual experiences. So he's not just thinking about, okay, how many people did we lose today? How many people got sick today from COVID-19? But he's thinking about the families that he's heard from, people that he's met. And he always will push us to say, okay, you're proposing that solution. Tell me how that's going to help the mom and pop shop that sells ice cream that I spoke to last week. Tell me how that's going to help the family that called me last week that's struggling because their kids can't go to school. The other thing that is really striking about him is the practical. Like he doesn't want just pie in the sky plans. He really wants to know, how are we going to get this done? How are we going to get a vaccine distributed to everyone who needs it? How are we going to ensure that we close the testing gap so that everyone who needs a test can get one and can get one at an affordable rate? So I think what you would see under a Biden presidency, if he has the privilege to serve, is you would see focus on data science and scientists. You'd see them speaking more directly to the public. You would see an effort to really rebuild trust that's based on very open, transparent communication. You would see an effort to build specific concrete action plans around key initiatives like closing that testing gap, distributing vaccines, and accelerating the development of new therapeutics.
In closing, Vivek, Hippocrates said, before you heal someone, ask them if they are willing to let go of the things that make them sick. And I'm prefacing my question with that quotation, thinking that one of the delicious moments in your book is when you quote a Robin Dunbar who talks about the importance of laughter. And I'm curious how laughter might help us in our struggle against loneliness.
It's a beautiful statement from Hippocrates, and what it makes me think about is that there's a lot in society and in life that contributes to our illness and to our unhappiness. When we go to the doctor, when I would have patients come to see me in the hospital, I now recognize that a significant amount of what contributed to their illness likely was outside of the subjects that I had studied in medical school, that the quality of their relationships, the nature of safety in their neighborhood, their access to fresh food, their access to meaningful work, and a sense of purpose in their life. These things contribute in extraordinary ways to our health and to our well-being. Yet we tend to think about health in a much more narrow box as being related to whether we were exposed to an infection or whether we ate the right food or whether we exercised or not. And those are important components, but certainly not all of what drives health. And I think this whole subject of loneliness and social connection is just one more example of the powerful impact that our social lives have on our health. And as we think about our lives, but also as we think about the future of society, I think it could not be more important that we recognize that building a life and a world that's centered around people and relationships, it could not be more important or pressing than in a moment where we are struggling with public health challenges, where we're also struggling with polarization. Because keep in mind that our relationships are not just a foundation for our good health. They're also the foundation for dialogue. They're what enables us to pause, to listen to one another, to have real conversation, and to come together to address difficult problems. So whether you're concerned about the health crises we are facing, whether you're concerned about polarization in our society, whether you want our workplaces to be healthier and stronger, whether you want our kids to be able to learn more effectively and to have the tools to lead fulfilling and healthy lives. In all of these avenues, it turns out that relationships matter, and that giving our kids the tools for building strong relationships, building a culture that really prioritizes people, that asks the fundamental question, how do we put people first in how we design institutions and how we design our lives? That to me is the central question that concerns me as a parent and as somebody who wants the world to be stronger for my kids and for future generations.
And laughter?
And laughter, gosh, laughter is it's a great connector, and it's something that that both Robin Dunbar and other researchers in this space have realized is the glue that brings us together. So finding moments of laughter is not only important for us to feel better, but when we laugh together with others, it serves as an accelerant of our connection with them. And gosh, given everything we're dealing with right now in the world, I could not think of a more important time for us to find reasons to be joyful and reasons to laugh in between the serious challenges that we face.
Vivek Murthy, it's been a pleasure to speak to you and a pleasure to hear, I think, one of your boys in the background. It's really been wonderful to have you on the phone. Thank you so much for taking my call. Stay well, stay safe, and I hope we see each other before long.
Thank you so much, Paul. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you stay well as well. And yes, that was my 4-year-old son on my lap, trying to be as patient as he could.
That's wonderful. All the best. Right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.